Brown County, Minnesota, late autumn 1872. The first hard frost had come, leaving the prairie grass stiff and pale. Smoke rose from chimneys across the valley, and in every yard men stacked wood, cord upon cord, the measure of survival made visible. On one claim, 9 miles from town, there was no man. Only a woman standing at the edge of an unfinished cabin, holding a splitting maul she did not know how to swing. The walls were up but breathing. The roof was boards without pitch. Behind her, the woodpile told the truth, barely enough for a month. She had arrived in Brown County in August of 1872 with a husband, 2 sons, and the deed to 80 acres of open prairie 9 miles southwest of New Ulm. By September, the husband was dead. A wagon overturned on a muddy descent near the river landing. The axle caught his chest. He died before Maren could reach him. She stood at the edge of the claim now with $31, 2 boys who could not swing an axe, and a cabin that was not a cabin. It was a shell. 4 log walls, 16 by 20 feet. A roof of loose boards that breathed daylight through every seam. 1 shuttered window. 1 door that did not close flush. A clay hearth already cracked from settling. Behind the shell, the woodpile told the real story. 1.5 cords, mixed quality. Some of it still green. Elias Brundage rode over on the 3rd day after the funeral. He was 58 years old, a former Army freighter who had supplied outposts through 2 territorial winters before taking his own claim. 15 years in the Minnesota River Valley. He had buried 1 hired man to exposure and lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite the winter of '64. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the cabin, running his remaining fingers along the gaps between logs. He looked at the roof. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at Maren, who stood near the door holding a splitting maul she had never learned to swing properly. "Half your seams are breathing," Elias said. "Anywhere a knife blade fits, so does winter." Maren said nothing. "That roof will sweat and freeze," he continued. "Every board will cup. By January, you will hear the wind in there like it is sitting beside you." "The roof was not finished," Maren said. "Jens meant to. Jens is dead." Elias said it without cruelty. He said it the way you would say the sun had set. "You have maybe 1.5 cords there. Mixed, from the look of it. Green in parts. A finished cabin with proper chinking burns a 1/4 cord a week in hard cold. This thing?" He gestured at the walls. "You will burn 1/2 cord a week just to keep the boys from shivering. And when January turns, when it truly turns, you will burn more than that and still not be warm." "How much do I need?" 5 cords. 6 to be safe. Can you fell trees?" "No." "Can you haul logs?" "I have 1 mule." "Can you split a cord in a day?" Maren looked at the maul in her hands. She had blisters from an hour's attempt that morning. She had split perhaps 20 pieces. A cord was 128 cubic feet. "No," she said. Elias looked at her boys. Ola, 9. Henrik, 6. They stood by the corner of the cabin watching. "You keep those boys in that shell when January turns," Elias said, "and I will help carry them out." He mounted his horse and rode west without looking back. That night, the wind pushed ash from the hearth back into the room. The smoke did not rise. It curled and sank and crept along the floor. Henrik coughed in his sleep. Ola woke twice and asked if the fire was dying. Both times Maren told him no. Both times she was not certain she was telling the truth. She lay awake calculating. $31. Firewood sold at $3 a cord in New Ulm, but she could not haul it herself. Delivery added another $1, $4 a cord, and she needed 4 cords minimum, more likely 5. $16 to $20. That left 11 to 15 for flour, salt, lamp oil, and whatever else the winter demanded. The numbers did not work. She could hire a man to cut wood on the claim. But a cutter wanted $1 a day plus meals, and a good cutter needed 3 days to fell, buck, and split a cord. $12 to $15 for the cutting alone. Now the numbers worked even less. She could sell the mule. $8, maybe 10. But then she had no way to haul water when the creek froze. She could sell the claim. Silas Pruitt at the Mercantile had already made that offer. $40 for the improvements. Forgiveness on the $18 she still owed for cabin lumber. Walk away whole, he said. Start over somewhere else, somewhere you have kin. But she had no kin within 500 miles. She had no money for passage east. And if she sold the claim, she sold the only thing Jens had died trying to build. The wind shifted. The cabin creaked. Ash lifted from the hearth and drifted toward the beds. Maren understood in that moment that Elias was not wrong. He was not cruel. He was simply accurate. She was going to lose the boys unless something changed. The change came 6 days later on the river road. She had walked to town for salt and 20 pounds of flour. The trip took most of a day, 4.5 hours walking each direction, an hour in town stretching the coins as far as they would stretch. She returned with flour on her back and salt in her coat pockets, and the sun already sinking toward the western grass. A half-mile from the ferry landing, she passed a yard behind one of the river warehouses. Canvas lay in a pile there, heavy cloth, weathered gray, stained with pitch and tar. Boat canvas, salvaged from a stripped or retired rivercraft. The Minnesota had carried steamboats and freight barges since before the war. Their rigging and deck covers cycled through repair yards and scrap dealers. Maren stopped. The canvas was old, patched in places, but thicker than any wagon cover she had seen, and large. She could see at least 40 square feet of it bunched there, probably more underneath. Her father's voice rose in her memory. Her father had been a freight teamster and sometime river haul hand back in Norway and through the first years in Wisconsin. She remembered him stretching waxed canvas over a wagon load one November, pulling it tight with mittened hands while the lantern flame flattened in the wind. She had been perhaps 12. She had asked why the cover mattered if the cargo was not wet. Wind steals warmth faster than cold does, he had said. Stop the wind first, then worry about the cold. She remembered the smell of pine tar on the cloth, the rasp of canvas over rough wood, frost on her father's beard, the lantern light turning the canvas amber. She stood there on the river road, salt weighing down her pockets, flour aching in her shoulders, and she thought about her cabin, about the seams between logs, about the wind she could hear inside the walls every night. The canvas was not insulation, but her father had not used it for insulation either. He had used it to stop the wind. The man who owned the canvas was a chandler named Rolf Stain, who supplied boat tackle and hardware to the river traffic. The canvas was scrap from a decommissioned freight barge, deck cover, and side awning, too worn for sale, not yet rotted enough to discard. He had been meaning to cut it up for patches. How much? Maren asked. Stain looked at her. A widow, clearly. Flour and salt. 9 miles from town on foot. What do you want it for? Does it matter? It matters to the price. Maren thought about lying, about claiming she wanted patching material, scrap for repairs, but she could see the size of the pile. She could not afford to buy it piece by piece. I want to stretch it over my cabin, she said, as a second skin, to stop the wind. Stein stared at her. Then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the surprised laugh of a man hearing something he had never considered. A boat cover over a cabin, he said. That is a new one. How much? Stein looked at the pile again. He looked at the flour on her back. He looked at her eyes, which did not look away from his. $4, he said. And you haul it yourself. $4 was flour for 6 weeks. It was a third of her lamp oil budget. It was the difference between reaching spring and not. But the woodpile was not growing. The cabin was still breathing. and her father's voice was still in her head. "I will return for it tomorrow," Maren said. "With the mule." Annie Sorum came by the next afternoon. Annie was 34, Norwegian-born like Maren, settled 3/4 of a mile to the northwest with a husband and 3 children. She had brought boiled eggs and a slab of salt pork, the gesture neighbors made after a death, the gesture that said, "We know you cannot spare the time to cook properly." She found Maren in the yard, spreading gray canvas across the frost-hardened ground. "What is that?" "Boat canvas." "I can see what it is." Annie stood with her arms folded. "What are you doing with it?" Maren did not stop spreading. The cloth was heavier than she had expected, stiff with old waterproofing and patched with sail twine in a dozen places. It smelled of tar and river water and years of weather. "I am going to stretch it over the cabin," Maren said. Annie said nothing for a moment, then, "Over the cabin. As a second skin, outside the logs, with a gap between." "Why?" Maren straightened. Her back ached. Her hands were already blackened from the pitch and grime on the cloth. "Because the wind goes through the walls," she said, "through every seam, every gap, every crack in the chinking. The fire heats the room, and the wind steals it before the heat reaches the beds. If I stop the wind before it reaches the logs, the fire's heat stays inside longer." Annie looked at the canvas. She looked at the cabin. She looked at Maren as though Maren had announced she intended to fly. "Canvas rots," Annie said. "It will last one winter. It will slap itself to ribbons in the first real storm." "Not if I stretch it tight enough." "And if snow sits on it? If ice builds up? That roof will not hold extra weight. You will have a collapsed grave instead of a house." Maren knew Annie meant well. Annie had survived 3 Minnesota winters. Annie had lost a daughter to croup the second year and knew what cold could do to children who were already weak. Annie was voicing sensible objections, and every one of them had already occurred to Maren. "The canvas is for the walls," Maren said. "Not the roof. The walls and the north-facing roof slope only, and I will set it tight enough that snow slides off instead of sitting." "How do you know it will work?" "I do not." "Then why?" "Because I have $31, Annie. I have 1.5 cords of wood. I have 2 boys who cannot swing an axe in a cabin that breathes winter through every seam. Elias Brundage told me I would burn through my wood before February and still be cold. He told me I would carry the boys out frozen." Annie's face changed. She knew Elias. She knew his reputation. "He said that?" "He said that, and he was not wrong. So I can spend my $31 on 4 cords of wood that will keep us shivering until March. Or I can spend $4 on canvas that might cut my wood use in half. If it works, the same wood pile lasts twice as long. If it fails, I am $4 poorer and no worse off than before." Annie looked at the canvas again. Her expression had shifted from disbelief to something closer to calculation. "You do not know how to rig this," Annie said. "No. You do not know how to stretch canvas." "I know it needs to be tight. I know it needs to shed water. Beyond that," Maren shrugged, "you are gambling everything on something you do not know how to build." "Yes," Annie shook her head. But she left the eggs and the salt pork, and she did not say Maren was wrong. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only understood the usual way of doing things? Silas Pruitt came by 3 days later. He did not bring food. He did not bring sympathy. He brought a ledger book and a pocket watch and the expression of a man calculating assets and liabilities. Silas was 46, sharp-faced, with a beard trimmed close, and clothes that cost more than Maren's entire cabin. He owned the Mercantile in New Ulm. He also held the note on Maren's claim, $18 still owed for the cabin lumber Jens had bought on credit. If Maren defaulted, Silas could take the improvements and sell them to someone else. He walked the perimeter of the cabin exactly as Elias had. But where Elias had looked with experience and pity, Silas looked with calculation and something that might have been anticipation. "Mrs. Halverson," he said, "I heard about your project." Marin was on a ladder she had built herself poorly from scrap lumber. She was tacking spacer strips to the upper logs, creating the framework that would hold the canvas away from the walls. "Word travels," she said. "In a valley this size, word always travels." Silas looked at the canvas lying in the yard, at the spacer strips, at the ladder that wobbled slightly with every hammer stroke. "They're calling it boat cloth housekeeping. They say you mean to sail the cabin south." Marin did not answer. She drove another tack. "I came to make you an offer," Silas said. "Again, more generous than last time. $50 for the improvements, full forgiveness of the note. I will even pay for your passage to St. Paul, where I understand you have a cousin." "I have no cousin in St. Paul." "Chicago, then, or wherever you like. The point is you walk away whole. You take the boys to somewhere with family, with resources, with prospects. And you let me sell this claim to someone who can actually work it." Marin came down the ladder. She stood facing Silas, close enough to see the flecks of gray in his beard, the polish on his buttons, the softness of hands that had not split a cord of firewood in a decade. "And if I stay?" Silas smiled. It was not a kind smile. "If you stay, the note comes due in April, $18. If you cannot pay, I take the improvements, the cabin such as it is, the fencing, the wellhead, and you leave with nothing." "I will pay the note." "With what?" "Your husband is dead. You have no income. You have—" He gestured at the canvas, boat scraps, and a scheme no one believes in. "Then no one will miss me when I freeze." "Mrs. Halverson, Mr. Pruitt." Marin's voice was level. She was not angry. She did not have the energy for anger. She was simply stating facts. "You came here to frighten me into selling cheap. You're wasting your time. I will not sell. I will pay the note, or I will freeze. Either way, you will not get this claim for $50. Silas's smile faded. Something harder replaced it. "Pride is expensive in January," he said. "So is bearing children. I will take my chances." Silas looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked at the boys, who had come around the corner of the cabin and were watching. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked back to his horse. "One winter," he called over his shoulder. "That canvas will not last one winter, and when it fails, Mrs. Halverson, remember that I tried to save you." The man who would save her arrived 3 days after that. His name was August Lindholm, though everyone called him Gus. He was 64 years old, Finnish-born, and had spent 30 years working boats on the Great Lakes and the upper Mississippi before his back gave out, and he settled near a ferry crossing to repair tackle and rig sails for whoever needed them. He found Marin standing on her poor ladder, trying to fix a rope through a canvas grommet that kept tearing under the strain. "You're going to pull that grommet clean through," he said. Marin looked down. She saw an old man with white hair and a face weathered to the color of oak bark. He carried a canvas satchel over one shoulder. "And then you will have a hole where the rope was, and the whole corner will flap loose in the first real wind, and the flapping will tear the next grommet, and the next, until you have a pile of shreds instead of a cover." Marin came down the ladder. "You know canvas?" "I repaired canvas for 30 years, boat covers, deck awnings, sails when we still used them." He looked at the spread of gray cloth around the cabin, at the spacer strips, at the rough framework she had built. "This is not a bad idea, but you are building it wrong." "Show me." Gus Lindholm did not move. He studied her face, her hands, the bruises on her palms from hammerwork, the grime under her nails. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Marin was tired of explaining. "Because I have no other way to keep the boys warm." You could sell. No. You could leave. No. You could burn the furniture, then the fencing, then tear boards from the shed. And then what? Burn the cabin itself? Move into the snow? Gus smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible under his white beard, but it was real. You have already thought through the alternatives, he said. Yes. And this is what remains. Yes. He set down his satchel. From it he drew a sail needle, a palm guard, a ball of wax twine, and a tool Marin did not recognize, a smooth wooden cone with a groove around its middle. That grommet is brass, he said. Old brass, corroded at the edges. You cannot run rope directly through it. The friction will saw through the canvas. You need a thimble, a rope eye sewn around the grommet, so the load goes through the twine, not the cloth. And you need to pull from corners, not from edges. A corner splits the load 4 ways. An edge splits it 2. Marin watched him work. His hands were knotted with age, but they moved with the ease of old habit. In 20 minutes, he had reinforced the grommet, run a thimble through it, and shown her how to tie a tension knot that could be adjusted without untying. Where did you learn this? She asked. On the water. 30 years on the water. He looked at the cabin again. Your spacing is wrong too. You have the strips too close to the logs. Wind will press the canvas flat against them, and then you lose the air gap. You need more standoff, 4 inches minimum, 6 is better. I do not have enough lumber for 6-inch strips. Then use poles, saplings, anything that holds the cloth away from the wall. He picked up her hammer, tested its weight, set it down. The cloth is good, heavy. The tar and pitch coating will shed water. If you rig it properly, it will last the winter. If you rig it like you're rigging it now, the first January gale will strip it off and drop it in the next county. Will you teach me? Gus looked at her. Why should I? Because you walked 3 miles to tell me I was doing it wrong. Because you brought your tools. Because you have not left yet. Another small smile. You are quicker than you look. I'm desperate. Desperate people think fast. Gus picked up his satchel. I will come back tomorrow early. Bring your boys. They can hold stakes while we work, and cut saplings tonight. Willow, if you have it. Anything straight and 4 feet or longer. Why are you helping me? He paused at the edge of the yard. Because you measured the wind side first, he said, before you measured anything else. Most people measure the sunny side and hope. You measured where the damage comes from. He adjusted his satchel. That is not desperation. That is thinking. I will see you tomorrow. The next 4 days were the hardest of Marin's life. Gus returned at dawn each morning and did not leave until dark. He taught by demonstration, not lecture. When Marin made a mistake, he did not explain why it was wrong. He showed her what would happen. The first day, he pulled a corner of the canvas loose and let the wind catch it. Marin watched the cloth snap and billow, watched the stress concentrate at the grommets, watched one begin to tear before Gus secured it again. That is what happens when tension is uneven, he said. The cloth finds the weak point and tears it open. Now, help me do it right. They re-rigged the corner, double-folded the hem, ran rope through reinforced edges, pulled from corners first, then edges, then filled in the center. When they released it, the cloth lay taut and still. The same wind that had torn at it now slid over it without grip. The second day, Gus taught her about water. He poured a bucket over the canvas and showed her where it pooled, every sag, every low point, every crease where stitching had pulled the cloth out of true. Water that sits freezes, he said. Ice that builds weighs. Weight that pulls tears. Your enemy is not the cold. Your enemy is standing water. Make it run off or it will kill you. They spent the afternoon adjusting tension until the water sheeted off like rain from a pitched roof. Marin's arms ached. Her fingers were raw from hauling rope. But when she poured the next bucket, it ran clear to the edge and dripped to the ground. The third day, Henrik developed a cough. Marin woke in the dark to the sound of it, a wet rattling sound that had not been there the night before. She lit the lamp and found Henrik hot to the touch, his forehead slick with sweat despite the cold. Gus arrived at dawn. He took one look at Marin's face and understood. The boy. Fever. Cough. Bad? I do not know yet. They worked in silence that day. When the light faded, only the north wall was finished, canvas stretched tight, air gap visible at the eaves, bottom hem weighted with stones and staked to the frozen ground. Gus looked at what remained, the south wall, the west wall, the roof slope. 3 more days, he said. Maybe 4. The weather will not wait. No, it will not. He gathered his tools. I will return at first light. Have the boys ready, even the sick one if he can stand? We need every hand. The 4th day the sky changed. It was not a storm yet, not a blizzard, not even snow. But the color shifted. The pale gray of ordinary cold gave way to something darker, something with weight. Farmers at the landing road were talking about the barometer. It was falling. Gus worked faster than he had worked before. He did not stop to explain. He simply showed, corrected, moved on. By noon, the south wall was up. By dusk, the west wall was half finished. Henrik's cough had not worsened, but it had not improved. Ola had taken over the lighter tasks, holding stakes, passing tools, feeding the fire inside while Marin and Gus worked outside. As the sun set, Gus stood back and looked at the cabin. It looked like nothing anyone had seen before. Gray cloth hung over dark logs, pinned and roped and stretched, the gaps and seams sealed with folded edges and weighted hems. It looked like a beached ship. It looked like something that did not belong on land. 2 more days, Gus said. The west wall and the north slope of the roof. Then you are as ready as you can be. Will it be enough? He looked at the sky. We will find out. They finished on the 6th day. The last seam closed at dusk. Gus tied off the final tension rope, tested it with his weight, and stepped back. The cabin stood wrapped in gray, cloth over logs, air gap at every joint, hems weighted and staked, corners reinforced with doubled rope. Inside, the wind noise changed, not gone, changed. Where before the wind had moaned through the cracks, pressing cold through every gap, now it whispered higher and farther away. The canvas took the blow. The air gap took the second blow. By the time the cold reached the logs, it had lost its edge. Marin stood by the stove and listened. The fire sounded different too. It crackled without fighting. The smoke rose straight instead of curling back. The heat seemed to stay where she had made it. Does it work? Ola asked. We will see, Marin said. Outside, Gus was packing his tools. Marin followed him into the yard. What do I owe you? She asked. Owe me? For the work, for the teaching. 4 days of labor is nothing. He slung his satchel over his shoulder. I did not come for money. I came because you were building something I had never seen before, and you were building it wrong. Now you are building it right. If it works, tell people how. If it fails, he shrugged. Then we both learned something. Thank you. He paused. The last light was fading. The canvas on the cabin seemed to glow faintly, catching the last of the sun. Your father was a freight man? He asked. Yes, and a river hand for a time. He taught you to think about wind before cold. Yes. Gus nodded. Then thank him. I only showed you what he already knew. He walked away into the dusk. Maren watched him until he disappeared beyond the first rise. The early performance surprised her. She measured the way frontier people measured, by woodpile, by heat, by frost. Before the canvas, she had burned nearly an armload of wood in the morning and another at dusk, plus extra through the night when the cold deepened. Now, the same fire lasted longer. The frost that had formed on the interior logs each morning before dawn, that faint white rime that meant the walls were stealing heat, appeared later and thinner. Some mornings it did not appear at all. Elias Brundage rode by on the 8th day. He sat on his horse and looked at the wrapped cabin, his face unreadable. "Quieter in there?" he asked. "Yes." "Warmer?" "I think so. I've not measured properly." "You cannot measure warmth. You can only measure the wood that makes it." He looked at her wood pile. "You have burned less than I expected?" "Yes." He sat there a moment longer. Then, "Real cold has not started. When it hits 40 below, when the wind comes straight from the north for a week without breaking, that is when you will know." "I know. I am not saying this to frighten you. I know that too." He nodded. Something in his expression shifted, not approval, not yet, but something closer to suspended judgment. "We will see," he said, and rode on. Annie came the next day. She walked the perimeter of the cabin as Elias had, touching the canvas, feeling the tension, examining the grommets and rope work. "The man who helped you," she said, "the Finnish boatwright. Gus Lindholm. He knows what he's doing." "Yes." Annie crouched at the base of the north wall, where the canvas hem was weighted with stones and staked every 2 feet. "I still think moisture will be a problem," she said. "If water collects between the cloth and the logs, it will rot both." "The cloth sheds water, and the air gap allows circulation. Gus was very specific about that." "Gus was specific about many things, I imagine." Annie stood. "But he is not the one who will live here when the ice comes." "No, I am." Annie looked at her. "You really believe this will work?" "I believe it is better than what I had before. Whether better is enough." Maren shrugged. "I will know soon." "The sky is changing." "I know." Annie looked west, where the clouds had thickened to something dark and heavy. "The men at the landing say the barometer is still falling. They say it feels like 73. 1873. The year of the great blizzard that old-timers still talked about. The year when whole families froze in their beds. "I know," Maren said. Annie did not offer to help, but she did not leave immediately either. She stood there, looking at the cabin, looking at Maren, looking at the sky. "If it gets bad," she said finally, "send the older boy. We have room." "Thank you. I am not saying your way will fail." "I know what you are saying." Annie nodded. Then she walked away into the gathering dark. The storm came on January 7th. The morning was mild, strangely mild, warm enough that Maren stepped outside without a coat and stood for a moment in the pale sunlight, feeling the air on her face. The boys were better. Henrik's cough had faded to a dry rasp, and his fever had broken 3 days before. Ola had grown stronger from the work, hauling wood, carrying water, helping Maren with the small repairs that the canvas system demanded. They were still children. They were still small. But they moved now with purpose instead of fear. At noon, the wind shifted. It came from the northwest, hard and sudden, like a door slamming. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first hour. By 2 o'clock, it had dropped another 15. The sky, which had been pale gray, turned the color of iron. The first snow came at 3. Not snow, really ice. Tiny crystals driven nearly horizontal by the wind. They struck the canvas with a sound like sand hitting sailcloth. Maren could hear them even inside, even with the door barred and the shutters latched. She checked the stove. Full. She checked the woodpile by the door, enough for the night if she was careful. The main pile outside was covered with a tarp protected from the snow. She checked the boys. Henrik was sleeping. Ola sat by the fire, watching the flames. "Is this it?" he asked. "The bad storm?" "I do not know yet." By 4 o'clock, she knew. The wind had not stopped since noon. It had not even paused. It came in a continuous, unbroken howl, pressing against the west wall like a living thing trying to get inside. But the canvas held. The rope creaked. The stakes groaned. But the cloth stayed taut, and the wind noise stayed high and distant instead of seeping through every crack. Maren stood by the west wall and listened. She could hear the canvas snapping in the gusts, a sharp, cracking sound like a sail filled suddenly by a hard gale, but it did not tear. It snapped, went taut, snapped again. The grommets held. The reinforced corners held. The ropes Gus had shown her how to tie stayed knotted. At 5 o'clock, visibility collapsed. Maren opened the door to check the woodpile and could not see the pile. She could not see the yard. She could not see anything beyond 5 feet of white chaos, snow and ice driving sideways, the world erased. She hauled in 3 armloads of wood, all she could reach without losing sight of the door, and barred the entrance. Inside, the stove glowed. The room stayed warm. The wind screamed outside, but inside, the boys slept. At 7 o'clock, someone knocked. Maren had not heard anyone approach. The storm was too loud, but the knock was unmistakable. 3 sharp blows on the door, desperate and hard. She unbarred it. Snow exploded inward. A figure stumbled through. A boy, perhaps 12, coated in ice, his face white with cold. "Mrs. Halverson," he was gasping. "Mrs. Sorum sent me, her youngest, fever. Their cabin is not holding." Maren pulled him inside, slammed the door against the wind. "Annie's boy is sick? Fever. Bad. And the cold, it is coming through their walls. Mr. Sorum is trying to hold blankets over the cracks, but Henrik's cough in the night, Henrik's fever." Maren knew what Annie was facing. "How far?" "3/4 of a mile, but I could not see. I followed the fence posts, but..." He was shaking, not just cold terror. He had walked 3/4 of a mile in a blizzard, in the dark, following fence posts he could barely see. "Stay here," Maren said. "Warm yourself by the fire. Watch my boys." "Where are you going?" "To help." She was already pulling on her coat, her heaviest coat, the one Jens had worn, too big for her but warmer for it. She wrapped a scarf around her face, pulled mittens over her hands. "You cannot go out there," the boy said. "You will die. Your mother sent you 3/4 of a mile in this storm to ask for help. She would not have done that unless she had no other choice. But watch the fire. Keep my boys inside. I will return." She opened the door. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow drove into her eyes, her mouth, every gap in her clothing. She could see nothing, nothing at all. But she knew the fence line. She had walked it 100 times. If she could find the first post, she could find the second, and the third, and the fourth, all the way to Annie's door. She stepped into the white. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. The fence post saved her. She found the first one by luck, stumbled into it, really, her shoulder hitting the rough wood before she saw it. After that, she counted, kept her left hand on the wire between posts, counted her steps. The snow screamed around her. The cold bit through her coat, her scarf, her mittens. but she kept counting. 37 posts to the Sorum claim. She knew because she had walked it before in clear weather, counting idly as she went. 37 posts, roughly 20 paces each. At post 19, she could no longer feel her hands. At post 26, she could no longer feel her feet. At post 31, she heard shouting. A figure emerged from the white. Mr. Sorum, Lars Sorum, a big man with a red beard and fear in his eyes. Mrs. Halverson, how? The boy reached me. How is the child? Burning up. And the cabin, the wind is coming through the walls. We cannot keep the heat in. Marin followed him to the cabin. The door faced southeast, away from the wind, but even so, opening it admitted a blast of cold that made the lamp flames flatten. Inside, Annie knelt by a pallet near the stove. On the pallet lay a child of 3 or 4, a girl, Marin remembered, the youngest Sorum daughter. Her face was red with fever, but her lips were tinged blue from cold. The cabin was no colder than Marin's had been before the canvas. But with a sick child, that cold was death. Your walls, Marin said. The chinking. We redid it this fall, but the wind, it finds every gap. Marin looked around the cabin. Blankets hung over the windows, rags stuffed into cracks. Every scrap of cloth the Sorums owned pressed against the walls. It was not enough. The cabin was bleeding heat faster than the stove could make it. We need to move her, Marin said. Annie looked up. Move her where? To my cabin. In this storm? She will freeze before we reach the door. She will freeze here. At least in my cabin, the walls do not breathe. Annie's face was a mask of exhaustion and terror. She looked at her daughter, then at Marin. Your canvas, she said. Does it work? I do not know. I think so. My boys are there now, and the room was warm when I left. You left your boys to come here. Someone had to. Annie closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had hardened. Lars, she said, get the heavy blankets. We are going. They bundled the girl in every scrap of wool the Sorums owned. Lars carried her against his chest, his coat wrapped around both of them. Annie carried a shuttered lantern, useless for light, but they could feel its heat through the metal. Marin led, finding the fence posts by memory and touch. The 3/4 of a mile took an hour. By the time they reached Marin's cabin, Marin could no longer feel anything below her elbows. Her face was a mask of ice. Her feet moved only because she told them to move. But the cabin was there. The gray canvas glowed faintly in the lantern light, taut and unbroken, snow sheeting off its surface instead of piling. She found the door, unbarred it, fell inside. Warmth hit her like a wave, not warm by the standards of a summer day, not warm by the standards of a proper house with proper walls, but warm. Warmer than the Sorum cabin, warmer than the storm, warm enough that the heat from the stove was not fighting a losing battle, but actually filling the space. Ola had kept the fire going. The room was bright with flame light. Henrik sat up in bed, watching. Mother, I'm fine. Help Mrs. Sorum with her daughter. They laid the child by the stove. Annie checked her breathing, felt her forehead, listened to her chest. The fever was still high, but the cold was no longer making it worse. The room is warm, Annie said. She looked around at the walls, at the logs that were not breathing, at the air that was not moving. The room is actually warm. The canvas. It works. Marin sank into a chair. She was shaking now, the cold catching up with her. Lars Sorum was stamping his feet by the door, ice falling from his beard. The lantern sat on the table, its flame steady in the still air. It works, Marin said. I think. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the children breathed. They waited through the night. The storm did not break. It did not pause. It howled from dusk until dawn, and past dawn into the gray light of a morning that was barely lighter than night. The temperature, Marin learned later, dropped to 34 below zero. Wind chill pushed it lower, lower than the oldest settlers could remember, lower than the year of the great blizzard, the year they had all feared seeing again. The Sorum girl's fever broke near midnight. Annie wept, silent tears that she did not bother to hide. Marin's boys slept through most of it. Henrik coughed twice, dry and light, and did not wake. Ola stirred when a gust shook the cabin, then rolled over and was still. The woodpile by the door shrank, but slowly, slower than it should have. Marin fed the stove every 2 hours, not every hour. The heat stayed in the room. At some point in the darkest hours, there was another knock at the door. Lars opened it. Elias Brundage stood in the gap, coated in ice, his horse somewhere behind him in the storm. "Checking the valley," he said, "making sure no one is dead yet." "Come in," Marin said. Elias stepped inside. He stood for a moment, feeling the air, looking at the walls. "Warm in here," he said. "Yes." "Warmer than it should be." "Yes." He looked at the fire, a good fire, but not a raging fire. He looked at the woodpile, smaller than evening, but not critically so. He looked at the people in the room, 2 families, 6 souls, all alive, all warm enough to sleep. "The canvas," he said. It was not a question. The canvas. He stood there a moment longer. The fire crackled. The wind howled. The canvas snapped once outside, then held. "I said I would help carry them out," Elias said finally. "If you kept those boys in the shell when January turned." "I remember. I came to warm my hands instead." He did not apologize. He did not admit he was wrong. But he stood by the fire and held his remaining fingers toward the flame, and he did not leave until the storm had begun to break. Morning came gray and still. The wind died at dawn. The snow stopped an hour later. When Marin opened the door, the world was white and silent and utterly transformed. The drifts were taller than the boys. The fence posts had vanished. The path to the woodpile was gone, buried under 4 feet of packed snow. But the cabin stood. The canvas hung tight and unbroken, crusted with ice but intact. The grommets held. The ropes held. The air gap, still visible at the eaves, had not collapsed. She walked the perimeter, testing the tension, checking for tears. Nothing. The wind had beaten against it all night, and it had held. Inside, her woodpile was still half full. She had burned less than half a cord in a night that should have taken more, much more. Annie came to stand beside her. "I thought you were a fool," Annie said. "So did I. I thought the canvas would tear. I thought the snow would collapse it. I thought you would burn through your wood and still be cold." "So did I." Annie looked at the cabin, at the gray cloth over the dark logs, at the thing that had kept 6 people alive through the worst night any of them could remember. "How did you know?" she asked. Marin thought of her father, of the lantern light, of the canvas pulled tight over a wagon load while the wind flattened the flame. "I did not know," she said. "I just had nothing else to try." The drifts took 3 days to clear enough for travel. The Sorums stayed the first night, left the second morning when Lars could finally see the fence posts again. Annie carried her daughter wrapped in blankets. The girl's fever gone, her color returned. At the door, Annie paused. "I was wrong," she said. Marin shook her head. "You were careful. There's a difference. I told you canvas rots. I told you it would slap itself to ribbons." And if I had built it the way I was building it, you would have been right. Annie looked at the cabin, at the gray cloth still crusted with ice, still taut, still holding. Teach me, she said, when the weather breaks. Teach me how to do this. I will. Annie nodded once, then followed her husband into the white morning. Word spread faster than the snow melted. Within a week, 3 families had visited the Halverson claim. They came to look, to ask, to measure. They walked the perimeter as Elias had walked it, touching the canvas, testing the tension, examining the stakes and ropes and weighted hems. Niels Bergstrom, who farmed 2 miles south, asked how much cloth was needed per wall. Christopher Dahl, who had lost 2 calves to the storm, asked if the method would work for a barn. Old Mrs. Lindquist, who had not left her cabin in 4 days during the blizzard, asked if flour sacks sewn together might substitute for boat canvas. Maren answered every question. She did not hoard the knowledge. She did not charge for advice. She showed them the grommets Gus had reinforced, the corners he had taught her to tension, the hem weights that kept the cloth from lifting in gusts. The gap is the thing, she told them. 4 inches minimum between the cloth and the wall. 6 if you can manage it. The cloth stops the wind. The gap traps still air. Still air does not steal heat the way moving air does. But where do we find boat canvas? Niels asked. We do not all live near the river road. You do not need boat canvas. Any heavy cloth will work if it sheds water, wagon covers, tarpaulin, even layered feed sacks if you oil them first. They listened. They measured. They left. 2 weeks later, Niels Bergstrom's cabin had a canvas windbreak on its north wall. 3 weeks later, the Dahl barn wore a patchwork of wagon covers over its windward side. By February, 5 households in the valley had some version of Maren's method: partial skins, wall covers, roof skirts over sleeping lofts. And the talk at the landing road changed. Elias Brundage came back in late January. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the edge of the yard one afternoon, dismounted, and walked toward the cabin as if he had business there. Maren was splitting wood. She had learned to swing an axe properly now, not with Jens's strength, but with enough precision to split around in 2 or 3 strokes instead of 6. Her hands had calloused, her shoulders had thickened. The woman who had held a maul she could barely lift was gone. Mrs. Halverson. Mr. Brundage. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the cabin. The ice had melted from the canvas now, and the gray cloth hung clean and tight in the thin winter sun. I have been asking questions, Elias said, about your wood usage. Have you? Bergstrom says you burned less than 2 cords between the storm and now. Is that true? Nearly, perhaps a bit more. A finished cabin with proper chinking would burn 3 in the same period. A cabin like yours, he paused. A cabin like yours was before, would burn 4, maybe 5. I know. Elias was silent for a moment. He looked at the wood pile, which was still substantial. He looked at the boys who were playing near the shed. He looked at Maren, standing with the axe in her hands. I told you I would help carry them out, he said. You did. I was wrong. Maren set down the axe. You were not wrong about the cabin. You were not wrong about the wood pile. You were not wrong about anything except whether I could change it. I did not think you could. Neither did I. He stood there, this man who had survived 15 winters in the valley, who had buried a hired hand to the cold, who had lost fingers to frostbite, who knew better than anyone how winter killed. I would like to see the inside, he said. I would like to understand how it works. Maren led him into the cabin. She showed him the walls that no longer breathed, the frost lines that no longer formed, the fire that no longer fought a losing battle against drafts that were no longer there. The air gap, Elias said, looking at the space between logs and cloth. That is the secret. Part of it, the windbreak, is the other part. The cloth stops the wind before it reaches the wall. The gap keeps the still air still. It is simple. Yes, it is so simple I should have thought of it myself. Marin smiled. Perhaps, but you did not need to. Your cabin is properly chinked. Elias looked at her. Something had changed in his face. Not warmth exactly, but respect. The respect of one survivor for another. If you are willing, he said, I would like you to show the Hendrickson family. They're 3 miles north. Their cabin is worse than yours was. They have 4 children and a grandmother who cannot walk. They will not survive another storm like the last one. I will go tomorrow. I will take you. The drifts are still deep past the river road. He left without saying anything else, but he had asked her for help. Elias Brundage, who had predicted her death, had asked her for help. That was validation enough. Annie Sorum came in February with needles, thread, and a bolt of oiled canvas she had bought from a peddler passing through. I want you to teach me, she said, properly, not just how it works, but how to build it. They spent 3 days together. Marin showed her everything Gus had shown her, the reinforced grommets, the tension knots, the corner first method, the water test. Annie learned quickly. She had sewn her whole life, and the needlework came naturally. The difficult part is not the sewing, Annie said on the 3rd day. It is the measuring, knowing how far to stand the cloth off the wall, knowing where the stress will concentrate. Gus taught me that. He said the cloth finds the weak point and tears it open. If you build with no weak points, the cloth has nothing to find. Where is he now? The Finnish man. Marin did not know. She had not seen Gus since he walked away into the dusk the night before the storm. I should find him, she said. Thank him properly. More than thank him. Bring him back. If this method is going to spread, you will need someone who can teach the building of it. You know the design, but the fine work, the canvas work, that is his. Marin knew Annie was right. The next morning, she walked to the ferry crossing to find Gus Lindholm. His cabin was smaller than hers, a single room 10 by 12 feet, set back from the ferry road in a stand of bare birch. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Come in if you're coming, a voice said. The latch lifts. She found Gus in a chair by his stove, wrapped in blankets despite the fire's heat. His face was gray, his breathing was shallow. The satchel of tools sat on the table, untouched. Mrs. Halverson. He did not seem surprised. I wondered when you would come. You are ill. I am old. There is a difference, but the result is often the same. Marin looked around the cabin. It was tidy but sparse. No canvas on the walls, just well-chinked logs and a solid roof. A bachelor's dwelling, built for one, lived in for years. The storm, she said. Did you? I survived, as I have survived many storms. But this one took something from me, something I will not get back. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. I am 70 in April, if I see it. You cannot stay here alone. I have stayed here alone for 8 years. Not like this. He looked at her. His eyes were still sharp, still clear, despite everything else. Why did you come, Mrs. Halverson? To thank you, and to ask for your help again. The method is spreading. People want to learn, but I cannot teach the canvas work the way you taught me. Then learn to teach it. I do not have 30 years of boat work in my hands. No, but you have something I never had. He gestured weakly toward the door. You have a reason to keep people alive. I repaired sails because I was paid to repair sails. You built that wrap because your boys would die without it. That is a different kind of knowledge. I still need your help. He was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled. The wind moved through the birches outside. I will give you my tools, he said finally. The palm, the needles, the wax, the rope, and I will tell you everything I know about tension and water and the places where cloth fails. But I will not be walking to your claim again. I do not have the strength. Then I will come here. He smiled, that same small, barely visible smile she had seen the first day. You are stubborn. I am alive. Sometimes they are the same thing. She visited Gus every third day through February and into March. Each visit, he taught her something new. How to read cloth for weakness, the places where the weave had thinned, where moisture had rotted the fibers, where the coating had worn away. How to patch a tear so the patch became stronger than the original. How to adjust tension when the cloth stretched or shrank with temperature. Canvas is not static, he told her. It moves with the weather. Cold makes it contract. Heat makes it expand. Wet makes it sag. You cannot fight those movements. You have to build a system that moves with them. He showed her his notebook, pages of measurements, sketches of tension systems, notes on failures he had seen in 30 years of boat work. He gave it to her on the last day of February. I will not need it anymore, he said. Do not talk like that. I will talk however I like. I have earned it. He coughed again. Listen to me. When I am gone, you will be the one who knows this method. Not just the idea of it, the building of it. The people who come to you will not be asking about canvas. They will be asking about surviving. Do you understand the difference? Yes. Good. Then you are ready. Gus Lindholm died on the 14th of March, 1873. Marin found him in his chair by the stove, the blankets pulled up to his chin, his face peaceful. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cabin was still warm. She buried him on a rise above the ferry road, where he could see the water if water could be seen. She kept his tools, his notebook, his name in her memory, and she went back to work. The secondary crisis came in April. Spring should have brought relief, but spring brought disease instead. A fever moved through the valley, not the killing fever of cholera or typhus, but a slower sickness that filled the lungs and weakened the body. Children were hit hardest, then the elderly. By mid-April, 3 families were too sick to work their claims. Marin had no medicine, she had no training, but she had something else, a method that kept sick people warm without burning through wood they could not cut. She went to the Hendrickson family first, the ones Elias had told her about, with 4 children and the grandmother who could not walk. Their cabin was worse than hers had been. Gaps in the chinking you could see daylight through, a roof that leaked when snow melted, a door that fit so poorly the cat came and went without anyone opening it. We do not have canvas, Mrs. Hendrickson said. Her face was gray with exhaustion. 2 of her children were in bed with fever. We do not have money to buy it. I know. Marin looked around the property. A wagon sat near the barn, an old wagon, its cover worn but intact. That cover, she said. May I use it? For what? For your north wall. It will not wrap the whole cabin, but it will break the wind where the wind hits hardest. Mrs. Hendrickson stared at her. You mean to wrap my cabin in a wagon tarp? Yes. People will think we are mad. People will think you are alive. In April, that is enough. They worked together, Marin, Mrs. Hendrickson, the 2 older children who were not yet sick. The wagon cover was not large enough for a full wrap, but it covered the north wall and part of the west. Marin used the techniques Gus had taught her, Corners first, tension even, no sag points where water could pool. By nightfall, the cabin was quieter. The drafts from the north had stopped. The fire's heat stayed in the room instead of bleeding through the walls. "It works," Mrs. Hendrickson said, her voice thick with wonder and something like grief. "It works, and we could have done this months ago, and my children would not be sick." "They would still be sick, but they will get better faster in a warm room than a cold one." Marin went to 3 more families that week. At each one, she improvised with whatever they had: wagon covers, flour sacks oiled with lard, even quilts layered over interior walls where exterior wrapping was impossible. None of it was as effective as proper canvas with a proper air gap. All of it was better than nothing. By the time the fever broke in May, she had helped 11 households. Gus was dead. But his knowledge was alive, spreading through the valley one improvised windbreak at a time. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Silas Pruitt watched all of it. He watched the families come to Marin for advice. He watched the canvas and wagon covers appear on cabins throughout the valley. He watched his prediction that the method would fail, that Marin would come begging, that her claim would fall into his hands, die a slow and public death. And he did not like it. In late April, Marin came to the mercantile to settle the $18 she still owed on her cabin lumber. She had earned the money teaching, not charging for the advice itself, but accepting payment for the labor of installing windbreaks for families who could not do it themselves. $5 here, $3 there. Enough to pay the note and have a little left over. Silas took the coins without meeting her eyes. He wrote the receipt without speaking, but when she turned to leave, he found his voice. "You think you have won something," he said. Marin stopped. "You think because a few desperate families put rags on their walls, you have proven me wrong. I think I paid my note. That was all I set out to prove. You were supposed to fail." His voice was low, harsh. "A widow with 2 children and no man to work the claim? You were supposed to sell. That is what widows do. That is what sense demands. I had other options. You had a scheme, a gamble, and it happened to work." He leaned forward across the counter. "But luck does not last, Mrs. Halverson. Next winter will come, and the winter after that. And sooner or later that canvas will rot, or tear, or fail in some way you have not anticipated, and then you will be right back where you started." Marin looked at him, at his trimmed beard and his soft hands, and his eyes that could not see past the edge of his ledger. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps I will learn to build it better. Perhaps the next generation of windbreaks will last 2 winters instead of 1. Perhaps in 10 years, every cabin in this valley will have some version of what I built, and people will not remember that you said it was impossible. They will not remember you either. No, they probably will not, but they will remember being warm. That is enough." She walked out of the mercantile and did not look back. Anders Mohn arrived in late May. He was a widower, 38 years old, with a blacksmith's build and a carpenter's hands. His wife had died 3 years earlier, leaving him with a forge, a half-built furniture business, and no reason to stay in St. Paul. He had come to Brown County looking for cheaper land and quieter work. He found Marin instead. Their courtship was not a courtship in the usual sense. It was a partnership. Anders needed someone who understood the valley, the weather, the particular demands of this particular place. Marin needed someone who could do the heavy lifting, the log work, the roof work, the labor her body still could not manage despite all her efforts. They met at the Dahl farm, where Marin was helping install a canvas skirt on the barn roof. Anders had come to deliver iron fittings for the barn door. He watched her work, watched her hands on the grommets, her eye on the tension, her quick corrections when the cloth began to sag. "You know what you're doing," he said. "I should. I have done it often enough." "Who taught you?" "A Finnish boatwright named Gus Lindholm. He is dead now." Anders looked at the barn, at the canvas, at the method no one in St. Paul had ever imagined. "Could you teach me?" Marin looked at him, at his calloused hands and his patient eyes and his total lack of skepticism. "No, why would you want to learn?" "Because I'm staying in this valley, and it seems like useful knowledge for a man who means to stay." She taught him. Over the summer, between the planting and the first harvest, she showed him everything Gus had shown her. Anders learned quickly, faster than she had in some ways, because his hands already knew how to work with materials that fought back. By August, he had wrapped his own small cabin near the forge. By September, he had helped 3 other families do the same. By October, he had asked Marin to marry him. She said yes. Not because she was lonely, though she was. Not because she needed help, though she did. She said yes because he had learned the method without questioning whether a woman should be teaching him. He had listened without condescension. He had worked alongside her without trying to take over. "I am not looking for a rescuer," she told him. "Good," he said. "I'm not looking for someone to rescue." They married in November in the small church at New Ulm, with Ola and Henrik standing as witnesses. The first snow fell as they walked out of the church. "Ready for another winter?" Anders asked. "Yes," Marin said. "I have been ready since the last one ended." The winters that followed were not easy. No Minnesota winter was easy, but they were survivable. Marin and Anders expanded the method. They experimented with different materials, heavier canvas, layered cloth, combinations of outer windbreaks and interior quilted walls. They developed a removable summer panel system so the canvas could be taken down in warm months and stored instead of rotting in place. They taught, not just individuals, but groups, gatherings at the Dahl barn, where families came to learn the basic principles and the fine points. Anders handled the heavy framing. Marin handled the canvas work. Together they could wrap a cabin in 2 days instead of 6. Henrik grew tall and serious, with his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness. Ola grew stronger and quieter, a natural teacher who had his mother's patience for explanation. And the hostile skeptic? Silas Pruitt's arc ended not with conversion, but with circumstance. In the winter of 75, a fire swept through his mercantile. The building was a total loss, stock, records, everything. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Silas was forced to rebuild, and rebuilding required credit he did not have. He came to Marin in January, not to apologize, not to admit he had been wrong, but to ask if she would wrap his new storage shed, a makeshift structure thrown up quickly to hold salvaged goods until the main building could be rebuilt. "The shed is unfinished," he said. "The walls are bare boards. If I lose the stock to cold or damp, I lose everything." Marin looked at him, at the man who had called her scheme foolish, who had predicted her failure, who had waited for her to crawl back and beg. "Why come to me?" she asked. "Because you are the only one in this valley who knows how to do what I need done." "There are others now. I have taught a dozen families. Anders has taught more." "I know, but they learned from you." His voice was flat, stripped of arrogance. "I am asking for your help, Mrs. Moen. I have no one else to ask." Marin could have refused. She could have let him suffer as he had been willing to let her suffer. But she thought of Gus Lindholm, who had helped her not because she deserved help, but because she was building something worth building. She thought of her father, pulling canvas tight in the lamplight, teaching her about wind without knowing the lesson would one day save her life. "I will help you," she said, "but you will pay me, and you will not pretend afterward that you built it yourself." Silas nodded. It was not grace. It was not humility, but it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was enough. They wrapped his shed in 2 days. The stock survived the winter. And when people asked where he had learned the method, Silas told them the truth. "Marin Moen," he said, "the widow who wrapped her cabin in a boat sail, she saved my stock." It was not an apology, but it was as close as Silas Pruitt would ever come. The years compressed. The boys grew into men. Ola married a schoolteacher's daughter and took over a farm north of New Ulm. Henrik became a carpenter, then a builder, then the man people called when they wanted a house that would stand against anything the weather could deliver. Anders's furniture business thrived. He built tables and chairs and bed frames from the same wood that heated the cabins he helped wrap. The forge expanded, the reputation spread, and Marin aged into the role she had never sought, the woman who knew. When a new family arrived in the valley, someone would eventually say, "Talk to Mrs. Moen, she will tell you how to prepare." When a hard winter was predicted, people would check their canvas, test their tension, oil their grommets, all the habits she had taught them, passed down now through families who had learned from families who had learned from her. She kept Gus's notebook until the pages began to fall apart, then copied it into a new one in her own hand. She kept his palm and his needles, though her own hands had grown too stiff to use them. She kept the memory of his voice, telling her that the cloth finds the weak point and tears it open, so you build with no weak points. Anders died in 1891 in his sleep, in the cabin they had shared for 18 years. Marin buried him on the same rise where she had buried Gus, and she did not cry until she was home again, alone, looking at the walls they had wrapped together. She lived another 6 years. She died in February of 1897 in the cabin that had started as a shell and become a home. Ola and Henrik were with her at the end. The fire burned steady in the stove. The canvas on the walls, replaced now 3 times, improved with each replacement, hung taut against the winter wind. Snow fell outside, soft and constant, but inside the room was warm. "Do you remember," she said, her voice faint but clear, "the night of the storm?" "The blizzard of 73, Henrik said. "I remember coughing. I remember being warm when I should have been cold. Elias Brundage came that night. He said he had told me he would help carry you out. He said instead he had come to warm his hands." "I remember." Marin smiled. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing shallow. "He was wrong, you know, at the beginning. He looked at the cabin, and he looked at the woodpile, and he saw death. He could not see what I was going to build." "No one could," Ola said. "Gus could. Gus saw it before I built it. That was why he helped." She opened her eyes, looked at her sons. "When I am gone, teach your children. Not just the method, the thinking behind it. The wind steals warmth faster than cold does. Stop the wind first, then worry about the cold." "We will," Henrik said. "Good." She closed her eyes again. The fire crackled. The wind whispered against the canvas. And Marin Tveit Halvorsen Moen, who had wrapped a cabin in a boat sail and saved her sons, went still. Within 10 years of her death, more than 60 households in Brown County and the surrounding valleys had adopted some version of the windbreak method she had refined. The technique spread not through books or newspapers, but through the way frontier knowledge always spread, neighbor to neighbor, family to family, one person teaching another how to survive. One specific detail outlasted the rest. Newcomers to the valley would sometimes see the gray canvas panels on cabins and barns and ask what they were. The answer became a local saying, repeated so often it lost its origin. That is Marin's rap. It keeps the wind where the wind belongs. Marin lived her final years in the same cabin she had fought to save, walked to church in New Ulm every Sunday until her legs would no longer carry her, and died in her bed surrounded by her sons. She was buried beside Anders and Gus on the rise above the ferry road. The gravestone gave her name, her dates, and nothing else. The people who knew her did not need a gravestone to remember. On the night she died, the wind blew hard from the northwest, the same direction it had blown on January 7th, 1873. The temperature dropped to 19 below zero. The snow drove sideways, piling drifts against every wall it could find. But inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and the canvas held, and the warmth stayed where she had built it to stay. Elias Brundage, dead now himself these 8 years, had stood in that same doorway on the worst night of that first winter and said, "You keep those boys in that shell when January turns, and I will help carry them out." What the valley remembered was not that she had wrapped a cabin in boat cloth. It was that, on the night the wind went looking for a way in, it could not find one. The boys had lived. The grandchildren had lived. The method had spread. And outside, the canvas snapped once in the gale, that same sharp cracking sound, like a sail filled suddenly by a hard wind, then held, as it had held every winter since the first one, waiting for the dawn,